Hello everyone and welcome to Archaeobiking. Today we're going to do a video on some history from my home state of Georgia. Specifically, we're going to do a video on James Oglethorpe, the short history of free Georgia, and the fight against African chattel slavery in the colonial South. Now, right off the bat, those of us in the modern world, as I always like to point out in these videos, whenever we hear the names for specific geographic or political regions, such as the state of Georgia, we tend to think of them as they are now. For example, we tend to think of Georgia, the state of Georgia, as it is seen on this map here. Now, obviously, that is not an incorrect view to have. After all, the state of Georgia has had this shape, has had its political boundaries, geographic boundaries, for around 160 going on 170 years or more. However, it's not the full picture. Despite the fact that there's no one left alive that has remember Georgia in any other way than what you see on this map. Georgia only took on this shape after a long series of processes, events, and catalysts. So, in order to get a better look at the broader picture to better understand how Georgia took on its political boundaries and its shape, we need to go back a little bit further in time to get a look at the bigger picture. Starting with specifically the colony of Georgia. Because after all, Georgia was originally founded as one of the 13 colonies of the British Empire in North America, the last of the 13 colonies specifically. But still, even before we look at the colony of Georgia, we first must look at the history of race and class struggles in the United Kingdom and the British Empire prior to the establishment of the colony of Georgia, starting with the 1500s CE up until the 1730s CE. So, first off, during the Tudor era being famous for kings of England such as Henry VIII, multiple vagabond acts would be passed providing for officers of the law to arrest and hold all such vagabonds, idle, and suspect persons living suspiciously, and them so taken to set in stocks, there to remain 3 nights and to have none other sustenance but bread and water, and after the said 3 days and 3 nights to be had out and set at large and to be commanded to avoid town. These acts would make few distinctions between those who are simply unemployed and looking for unemployment, and those who chose to live the life of a so-called vagabond. In addition, the act failed to recognize those who could not provide for themselves, which of course included the sick, the elderly, and the disabled. And all of these vagabond acts would be declared and established between 1494 and 1572 CE. And here's a picture from one of those acts, vagabond acts. I believe the last one, established in 1572, showing sort of what was to be expected to happen to vagabonds and beggars and other related individuals. Uh, After these vagabond acts, multiple poor acts would be passed to provide uh, a system of support for individuals who were willing to work, but who were having difficulty finding employment, such as providing justices of the peace, who were authorized to provide any town which needed it with a stock of flax, hemp, or other materials on which paupers could be employed. However, these laws also legalized whippings as punishment for vagrancy and established, quote, houses of correction, That should sound familiar to a lot of people watching this, but established houses of correction in every county for the punishment of those who refused to work, or at least were viewed as refusing to work. And all of these acts were established between 1572 and 1662 CE. Uh, One important thing to note that as the population of the British Empire rose, there was an increasingly stark class divide in the United Kingdom itself, with rampant poverty being present in the low class members of society. With things happening to the poor inhabitants of the United Kingdom, but not being limited to the poor inhabitants of the United Kingdom being press ganged into the British Navy, where they would face terrible work conditions and low wages. Also, poor English citizens were increasingly barred from hunting and foraging in the forests, as these areas were deemed the realms of nobility and the honorable hunt, which you can sort of see depictions of that in these pictures here. While all of this was happening, starting in 1554 CE, the British Empire would begin participating in the transatlantic slave trade, forcibly capturing and also purchasing uh, enslaved Africans, upon which they would be shipped by the tens and hundreds of thousands to the various British colonies, such as, say, Jamaica uh, or the United States. And between 1553 and 1800 CE, the British Empire would embark roughly 3 million enslaved Africans to America. For the exact number, it would be this number you see here, which would be 2,925,905 enslaved Africans shipped to the Americas and other British colonies between 1553 and 1800 CE. And to be fair, 1800 CE is a little bit outside of the scope of this video, but it still gives you a pretty good idea of what the of how many enslaved Africans were being forcibly removed and imported to British colonies during the height of the transatlantic slave trade. And this was specifically part of what is known as the triangular trade, whereupon which enslaved Africans would be captured and or purchased along the west coast of Africa, as well as the east coast of Africa, and then would be forcibly shipped across the Atlantic to the British colonies, as well as the British colonies in North America and the British colonies in the Caribbean, such as Jamaica, upon which they would help. Sorry, not help. They would be forced to harvest, quote unquote, help, forced to harvest raw materials such as rice, cotton, sugar, wood, uh, timber, etc., or they would be with those raw materials then being shipped back across the Atlantic to the United Kingdom, or they would be turned into manufactured goods, which would then be shipped for to Africa for trade to start the process all over again. And here's another map sort of showing the types of uh, raw materials that would be shipped to Great Britain and et cetera, et cetera. And because of the British involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, plantation culture would develop in early British colonies, such as colonial South Carolina between 1700 and the 1730s CE. And here is just sort of a graph showing the value per acre and how much raw material, i.e., rice in this case, these plantations produced. And of course, they were produced by forcibly exploiting enslaved Africans, exploiting them against their will. And it's as I always like to point out, African chattel slavery was very much a very brutal institution, with entire families being separated forcibly, punishments being brutally harsh, whippings among other horrible punishments, some involving boards, some involving iron mechanisms to place on their faces so that they couldn't speak or eat, brandings. And here's just another picture sort of showing how brutal the whippings to enslaved Africans and eventually African Americans could be. Then, uh, while the transatlantic slave trade was reaching its height, especially while the British Empire was reaching its height of participation in the institution, the Poor Relief Act would be passed, which would institute a quote workhouse test, which meant a person who wanted to receive poor relief had to enter a workhouse and undertake a set amount of work. Uh, and the test was intended to prevent, quote, irresponsible claims on a parish's poor rate, with this act being passed in 1722. Here's a picture of the act there, and there's one of the workhouses that people would be expected to go and take those tests. Now, admittedly, as you can see in the outfit and garb, this is actually from the 1800s, but it still gives you a general idea of what type of buildings and workhouses the poor individuals, low class individuals, would be expected to go to test out their work. Then in 1723 CE, the Black Act would be passed, which would criminalize anyone with a concealed or blackened face from being in a rural forest at pain of death. Similarly, it was an offense to hunt, kill, wound, or steal deer in these locations, with the first offense being punishable by a fine, the second offense, and the second offense being punishable by penal transportation. Other criminal acts included fishing, the hunting of hares, the destruction of fish ponds, the destruction of trees, and the killing of cattle in those locations, the last of which was also punishable by death. An offender could also be executed for setting fire to corn, hay, straw, wood, houses, or barns, or shooting another person. The same penalties applied to attempting to rescue anyone imprisoned under the Black Act, or attempting to solicit other people to participate in crimes that violate it. In total, the act introduced the death penalty for over 350 criminal acts. And here is an individual poaching a deer from a rural forest, and there is a depiction of somebody being hanged under the Black Act. Now this brings us to our next section, James Oglethorpe and his early philanthropy. So, as a member of Parliament, James Oglethorpe would publish an anonymous pamphlet titled The Sailor's Advocate, which specifically talked about press gangs and pay issues in response to the poor living and working conditions of sailors in the Royal Navy. And he would publish this in 1728 CE. Then, in 1729 CE, after his friend Robert Castell was sent to a prison known as Fleet Prison and eventually died, Oglethorpe would motion to investigate the prison's warden and was made chairman of the resulting committee. He then began touring debtors' prisons in late February, and in March finished the first of three detailed reports presented to Parliament. The reports described various abuses in the prisons, including torture, overcrowding, and widespread disease. They particularly attacked Thomas Bainbridge, the warden of Fleet Prison, where Castell had died. Oglethorpe urged reform of the prisons, mainly through prosecution of those in charge of them. Most of the blame was laid on the individual wardens rather than the system as a whole. So obviously, it was not a perfect critique or a perfect solution, And the reports would attract much attention, but little real change actually occurred. And these events would happen between February 25th and May 19th of 1729 CE. And here is a picture of Fleet Prison. As a result of seeing the struggles of the poor inhabitants of the British Empire, especially in relation to debtors' prisons like Fleet Prison, Oglethorpe would begin discussing with John Percival, the first Earl of Edgemont, a solution upon which 100 unemployed people from London would be settled in America to provide them with a fresh start. And he would begin this discussion in 1730 CE. There's John Percival, and there is Edgemont, a map of Edgemont. And here's a map of the British colonies in North America at the time. Seeking funding for his proposed venture, Oglethorpe would befriend Reverend and philanthropist Thomas Bray, becoming a member of the Board of Trustees of the Bray Associates in February of 1730 CE. However, it is important to note that despite his philanthropy, Oglethorpe was appointed in January 1731 to be the director of the Royal African Company, a company that specialized in the transportation of enslaved Africans as part of the transatlantic slave trade. That being said, it is also important to note that Oglethorpe was inspired by Thomas Bray and would begin devoting himself to the primary mission of the Bray Associates, that being the education and conversion of enslaved Africans. Though it is also important to note this was oftentimes these types of conversions were oftentimes against the will of the enslaved Africans, many of whom uh, were Muslim or had polytheistic beliefs. And also, a lot of times these conversions were unnecessary because a lot of West African kingdoms, such as the Kingdom of Congo, were already Christian, especially Catholic Christians, due to contact with the Portuguese uh, and the Spanish. Eventually, the Savannah River would be chosen by Oglethorpe and the Bray Associate trustees, as well as John Percival, as a location for a new colony for the unemployed British citizens to have a new start. And this would also be supported by the British Parliament, as it would provide a buffer between the prosperous Carolina colonies and Spanish Florida. At the same time, the Savannah River was being chosen as the location of the new colony by Oglethorpe and the trustees, the Bray Associate trustees. Oglethorpe would receive a letter from Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, a prince from West Africa, from the West African kingdom of Bundu, who had been captured and enslaved. Moved by the accounts of his suffering in the letter, Oglethorpe would purchase and free Diallo, eventually arranging for his return to West Africa. It's important to note Oglethorpe and Diallo never met in person. They only ever communicated by a letter. Another interesting thing that happened because of this is that as a result of this encounter, Oglethorpe would sell his stocks in the Royal African Company, with these events happening between 1732 and 1734 CE. The colony of Georgia would be founded in 1733, with the inhabitants including low-class Scottish Highlanders and German Pietists, Pietism being an offshoot of the Protestant Lutheranism branch of Christianity, specifically Pietists coming from Salzburg and modern-day Austria. And here is a map of the colony of Georgia, a sort of rough outline. This was the proposed boundary, but in reality, most people lived in roughly around this area, all the way down to the coast here. The assumption by many British aristocrats was that the low-class members of the colony would be given new starts as long as they obeyed the upper class and worked hard on silk growing farms. This was out of the belief that the best way for the low class to essentially better themselves and get themselves a better life was just through straight hard work. However, the low class members of the colony quickly asserted large degrees of personal independence, mainly due to being so far away from the imperial center. They were no longer in the United Kingdom itself, and they specifically preferred high-paying professions such as military service and cattle ranching to, instead of growing silk for the British aristocracy. Yes, South Georgia very much is a prime environment for cattle ranching. This would anger many aristocrats, including Oglethorpe, who would complain about the Scottish Highlanders refusing the low wages that he offered. Then in 1735 CE, Oglethorpe and the trustees would ban the sale of rum and ban African chattel slavery in the colony of Georgia. However, despite the prohibition on African chattel slavery, wealthy South Carolina plantation owners would continue to pressure the trustees and British Parliament to allow African chattel slavery to expand into Georgia, mainly because Georgia was viewed as uh, the prime environment for rice plantations and sugar plantations. Uh, in addition to the pressuring from the South Carolina plantation owners, a group of Georgia settlers known as the malcontents would regularly complain about the ban on African chattel slavery and would continuously petition the trustees for the institution's spread to Georgia. Now, this brings us to the reasons for Georgia's continued ban of African chattel slavery. Now, it should be noted that the majority of the inhabitants of Georgia would refuse to legalize African chattel slavery in the colony, and they would do so for a diverse set of reasons. It is also important to note that most of these reasons were most certainly not altruistic in nature, i.e., these were not out of concern for the enslaved Africans themselves or out of some belief that all people were created equal, etc. I mean, there was some of that, and we'll get into that in a second, but most of them were not that. Most of them had very, very specific, very selfish, and a lot of times racist reasons that they did not want African chattel slavery in Georgia. All right, so first off, ministers such as John Wesley, George Whitefield, and Johann Bolgius would denounce chattel slavery and its abuses between 1735 to, in some cases, 1740, in other cases, 1748. And this depends on each individual, and we'll get into that a little bit in a minute. Uh, Meanwhile, the Scottish Highlanders of Georgia's city of New Inverness, now known as Darien, would oppose the introduction of chattel slavery because the institution would not solve the problems within their community and because, quote, it is shocking to human nature that any race of mankind and their posterity should be sentenced to perpetual slavery. So, to the Scottish Highlanders' credit, there was very much some degree of moral and philosophical reasons as to why they did not want African chattel slavery in Georgia. They very much, at least at this point in time, viewed enslaved Africans and Africans in general as equals. This would not always be the case, but at least at this point in time, that was very much the case. In contrast to the Scottish Highlanders, the Salzburg Germans would oppose the introduction of African chattel slavery because enslaved Africans were associated with the Muslim Moors and Catholics from West African kingdoms, such as the Kingdom of Congo, both of which opposed Protestant Christians, such as the Salzburg Germans. In fact, the Salzburg Germans specifically stated that white people are in danger of life because of them. So, very selfish and very racist reasons as to why they did not want African chattel slavery within the colony of Georgia. Within the same vein, many members of the trustees of Georgia would refuse to introduce African chattel slavery out of fear of a similar rebellion to the Stoner Rebellion that occurred in South Carolina in 1739 CE. I've already done a video, in-depth video on the Stoner Rebellion that I will link in the iCard. And even more in vain with both the Stoner Rebellion and the fear of just general rebellions by enslaved Africans and African Americans. Oglethorpe and the trustees would fear the introduction of African chattel slavery as runaway enslaved Africans, including those in the Stoner Rebellion, would often flee or at the very least attempt to flee to Spanish Florida and join the Spanish army. Therefore, legalizing African chattel slavery in Georgia would potentially provide reinforcements to Spain, who at the time was an enemy to the British Empire. During the War of Jenkins' Ear, Oglethorpe would unsuccessfully lay siege to multiple forts in Spanish Florida, including Fort Mose, which was manned by primarily by formerly enslaved Africans who had been granted freedom by the Spanish Empire as long as they joined the Spanish military. The British militia would be repeatedly defeated by the militia of Fort Mose, consisting again of formerly enslaved individuals. This defeat at the hands of formerly enslaved individuals would confirm fears of runaway enslaved Africans joining the Spanish army. That being said, Oglethorpe would also gain immense respect for the abilities of African soldiers, both enslaved and free, with this battle happening in 1740 CE. This now brings us to our next section, the end of Free Georgia. So the end of Free Georgia could be argued to have began in 1740 CE when, despite previously opposing the legalization of African chattel slavery, Johann Bolgius would begin advocating for the institution's legalization in Georgia in order to protect Georgia's Salzburg German community. In conjunction with this, despite the ban of African chattel slavery, many wealthy lowland Scots who had settled in both Georgia and South Carolina, yes, lowland Scots, not Highland Scots, there is a difference, they would actively settle in both Georgia and South Carolina and actively defy the ban by establishing rice plantations in Augusta, Georgia, near the South Carolina-Georgia border, and thus far enough away from the capital of the colony of Georgia that they could sort of get away with more than you would be able to if you were, say, in Savannah, Georgia, or in New Inverness/Darien, Georgia. And this would begin happening in the mid 1740s CE. Then, in September 28th, 1743 CE, after another failed invasion of Spanish Florida, Oglethorpe would lose a great deal of support from the trustees, and as a result, Oglethorpe would leave Georgia permanently for England. With the end of the War of Jenkins' Ear, fear of runaway enslaved Africans fighting alongside the Spanish against Georgia would begin to wane, with the War of Jenkins' Ear officially ending in 1748 CE. Then, between 1748 and 1750 CE, despite previously opposing the introduction of African chattel slavery, George Whitefield would begin working with James Habersham to petition the Georgia trustees to legalize African chattel slavery. Whitefield would do this because he had come to value the profitability of the institution and would view chattel slavery as the best way to convert and provide salvation for enslaved Africans. After continued campaigns by the malcontents, wealthy South Carolina plantation owners, and ministers who support African chattel slavery, the trustees would officially legalize the institution in the colony of Georgia in January 1st, 1751 CE. Then, after its legalization, Whitefield and other ministers would use biblical verses to instill support for slavery and ideals of supposed white superiority to Africans and African Americans. These would be used as tools to maintain support for African chattel slavery from poor white settlers. And this would be done, would be continued to be used well into the 1850s and 60s. Now this brings us to our next section, Oglethorpe's fight against African chattel slavery. After his return to the United Kingdom, to London specifically, Oglethorpe would gradually begin to view African chattel slavery as immoral and would fight against common views of Africans being less than human by pointing to one, the African soldiers of Fort Mose, and great African civilizations such as the ancient Egyptian civilization as proof of African equality. Then, starting in 1774 CE, in the spring of 1774 CE specifically, Oglethorpe would befriend the formerly enslaved African Ulada Equiano. I'm sure I butchered that a little bit, and would introduce him to Granville Sharp. Oglethorpe would mentor both in the fight against African chattel slavery. Together, Equiano and Sharp would wage multiple legal battles against the institution of African chattel slavery. On the eve of the American Revolution, Oglethorpe would be an early believer of providentialism, believing that God would send a divine punishment in the form of war to the British Empire and other nations that practiced any form of slavery. Oglethorpe would also point out to pro-African chattel slavery advocates that enslaved Africans would fight to the death to earn their freedom, as seen in multiple rebellions throughout the 1770s CE. Along with Equiano and Sharp, Oglethorpe would mentor the anti-slavery advocate Hannah More during the 1780s. Then, in 1785, James Oglethorpe would die. Which now brings us to our next section, the legacy of James Oglethorpe and the aftermath of the fall of free Georgia. Well, for one thing, Equiano, Sharp, and Moore, all of whom were mentored to some degree by Oglethorpe in the fight against African chattel slavery, would be among the early founders of the abolitionist movement. Now, obviously, they wouldn't be the only ones, but they were still part of it, and they were all still mentored by Oglethorpe. And as Oglethorpe and others predicted, enslaved Africans and African Americans would fight for their freedom both against and alongside the British Empire in the American Revolution. Then, at the end of the American Revolution, the leaders of the American Revolution, such as Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, would refuse to abolish African chattel slavery in the United States, leaving Georgia as a slave state until the American Civil War. After the American Revolution, roughly 3,500 free and formerly enslaved Africans and African Americans would be evacuated from Georgia by the British to British colonies such as Jamaica and Nova Scotia, granting them their freedom, with these evacuations happening between 1782 and 1783 CE. In addition to this, enslaved Africans and African Americans would continue to flee Georgia for freedom in Native American communities, such as the Seminole Nation, and freedom in Spanish Florida between the 1780s and 1818 CE. And again, as Oglethorpe predicted, as well as others predicted, enslaved Africans and African Americans would fight for their freedom against the United States during the War of 1812, with formerly enslaved African soldiers invading Georgia itself in 1814 and 1815 CE. During and after the War of 1812 CE, roughly 4,800 enslaved Africans and African Americans, including 833 enslaved Africans and African Americans from the Georgia coast, would be evacuated by the British to colonies such as New Brunswick and Trinidad, where the enslaved Africans and African Americans would be granted their freedom, with these evacuations happening between 1814 and 1815 CE. Then, in 1834 CE, the abolitionist movement would eventually help abolish African chattel slavery in the British Empire. And of course, both before and after the abolishment of African chattel slavery in the British Empire, the abolitionist movement would spread to the United States in the 1830s CE. Then the American Civil War would lead to the abolition of African chattel slavery in Georgia. However, true equality still eludes African Americans in Georgia and the United States for 150 years or more, even really well to very much today into the present. All right. So with that, that brings an end to our video on James Oglethorpe, the short history of free Georgia, and Oglethorpe and Georgia's fight against slavery. I hope you enjoyed learning about this history. It's not a very well known part of Georgia history, um, or at the very least, it's not a very well known part of history if you're outside of Georgia, and it's very fascinating. And really provides a lot of perspective um, on United States history as a whole. And in some ways can be a little depressing. So with that, I'm going to end the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you would like me to cover any of the things that I covered in the video in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe, and I hope you all have a good day.